Wind cut across the desert like a silver knife, lifting loose sand and carrying it through the scattered canyons. Under the pale wash of a rising sun, the prairie seemed endless, a vast, silent land that belonged to no one but the wind itself. Somewhere in the distance, the low hum of a river echoed through the cliffs, threading life into a place otherwise ruled by dry dust and shadow. It was the kind of morning that carried the weight of stories, old as the hills, whispered in the cracks of stones, and in the long grass that bent but did not break. The Apache warrior stirred by the edge of his tipi, his sharp eyes tracing the horizon where dawn's gold bled into the deep blue of night's retreat. He was a man of quiet strength, built like the mesas that dotted the valley, all sinew and steady movement. His hands, calloused from bowstrings and spear shafts, knew the language of the land the way the earth whispered before a storm, how an animal left its tracks to tell its secrets. In the dim glow of the morning fire, shadows danced across his face, painting him in 1,000 small lines of patience and survival. For years he had walked these plains with a solitary purpose, not that he chose isolation, but the land had a way of keeping certain men apart from others, of teaching them lessons too harsh for crowded villages or polite company. His people had called him many things, but mostly they called him dependable, a man whose honor was a quiet drum, never loud, always present. He had seen travelers, drifters, and the occasional lost soul wander into the territory, but most moved on, too frightened by the expanse to linger. That morning, though, a sound prickled his awareness, a footstep too soft for the open plain, yet too deliberate to be the wind or an animal. She appeared at the edge of his sight like a flicker of movement, a girl no older than 17, maybe a little older, clothed in rags that had known many hands before his eyes ever fell on them. Her hair, dark and tangled, caught the morning light in streaks of copper, and her skin carried the chill of the early desert air. She moved with a hesitancy that suggested she had been hiding, or perhaps running, though from what he could not yet tell. Her eyes met his, wide, searching, and for a moment a silence stretched between them thick enough to choke the wind itself. The warrior's hand instinctively brushed the strap of his bow, though he did not move to raise it. There was a story here, one he could sense before words were spoken. A story of survival and fear, of a life shaped by forces far bigger than her small frame. Most travelers were cowards or fools or sometimes both. This one seemed neither. She had the steadiness of someone who had seen more than she should, someone who had learned the bitter taste of loneliness, but still carried hope like a fragile ember tucked against her chest. She stepped closer, though not yet into the warmth of his tipi. The wind tugged at her cloak, and the warrior noticed the small shiver that ran through her. A sign she needed shelter. Instinct pulled him forward, a quiet, unspoken understanding that danger could be anywhere out here. The desert was unforgiving to those who lingered too long in its open spaces without allies or protection. Yet even as he signaled her with a hand, something in the way she hesitated, in the tight curl of her fingers around her cloak, told him this encounter was not ordinary. "Are you lost?" His voice was low, steady, carrying the cadence of the plains. It was a voice meant to soothe as much as command respect. She flinched at the sound, and the flicker of fear in her eyes made him soften his stance. He did not advance further. I need. Her voice caught in her throat, the words almost swallowed by the wind. She could not finish. Something in her posture, the way her shoulders hunched against the cold, betrayed an exhaustion beyond that caused by travel. The warrior's gaze swept her quickly, noting the dirt streaked across her face, the rawness at her elbows and knees, evidence of travel through rough terrain, perhaps hiding or running. He gestured toward the tipi. "You may warm yourself," he said simply. There was no invitation to speak beyond necessity. He could sense her weariness, and he knew better than to force comfort on someone not ready to receive it. Yet the land demanded practicality, and survival often required small acts of trust. She hesitated, the wind tugging at her, the early light reflecting off her eyes in a way that almost seemed to pierce him. Then, slowly, she stepped forward, drawn not by the words but by the promise of warmth, a momentary refuge in a world that had not treated her kindly. As she entered, the shadows of the tipi seemed to reach for her, swallowing her into the small circle of firelight. The warrior's eyes did not leave her. He observed every twitch, every blink, every subtle tension in her posture. This was no ordinary traveler seeking merely a place to rest. There was something else here, something he could not yet name. He shifted slightly, the leather of his moccasins whispering against the earth, and the firelight caught the small lines on his face, making him appear both ancient and eternal. The girl settled near the edge of the fire, her hands stretched toward the warmth, though she did not yet dare draw fully close. She kept her gaze low, avoiding his eyes, yet the faint tremble in her chest betrayed the storm of thoughts within. The warrior felt a flicker of curiosity, not the idle curiosity of the bored or the superficial, but a sharper, more precise kind that pierced straight to the heart of mystery. There was a history here, he could tell, hidden beneath layers of silence and dust. Perhaps she had lost her way among families that could not or would not protect her. Perhaps there were people pursuing her who wanted nothing good in this world. The desert could hide many things, but it could also expose truths in the quietest moments. Outside, the wind carried a faint rustling, almost like whispering voices among the rocks. The warrior's hand brushed the side of his knife, a reflex born from long years of watching and waiting. He did not assume threat, but he respected possibility. He had learned that the forgotten corners of the world often held the sharpest surprises. The girl's lips parted again, and for a moment it seemed she might speak, might reveal the purpose of her journey, or the burden she carried. But instead, she inhaled sharply, holding something back, a secret too heavy for words. Her eyes, dark and alert, met his briefly, flickering with an emotion that he did not yet name fear. Yes, but also defiance. Or maybe a longing for something she had never dared to hope for. The fire crackled, sending sparks curling upward into the tipi's apex, and the warrior allowed himself a small exhale. The desert waited beyond the canvas walls, harsh and indifferent, yet inside this fragile circle of warmth, a tension took root. He sensed it would grow, would shape the hours and days to come. Perhaps change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. As he watched, the girl shifted slightly, drawing her knees closer to her chest. There was a vulnerability there, yes, but also a resilience. The kind that spoke of past hardships and a refusal to be broken entirely. The warrior understood that feeling. He had carried solitude and danger like old companions, but the sight of another soul, unexpected and uncertain, ignited something he had not realized. He had almost forgotten curiosity, perhaps even a spark of hope. Outside, the wind rose again, gusting against the tipi in wild, mournful whispers. The desert remained vast, endless, and unyielding. Yet here, in this small circle of firelight, the warrior and the girl existed in a fragile, tenuous peace. Both knew it would not last. The plains were not forgiving, and the stories of lost children and wandering travelers rarely ended without shadow. Yet neither moved to break the quiet, and the space between them grew heavy with unspoken questions, with possibilities neither dared speak aloud. The girl finally raised her head slightly, her eyes glimmering with a mixture of fear and defiance. The warrior noticed the faint tremor in her hand as it hovered near the fire, and he realized this encounter was only the first thread of a story much larger than either of them. A story of survival, of trust, of dangers lurking beyond the familiar, and of choices that might reshape their lives. He allowed himself a small nod, the first acknowledgement of her presence, not as an intruder, but as someone who had unknowingly entered the rhythm of his world. Outside, the desert sun climbed higher, yet inside, shadows and firelight danced together, marking the boundary between the known and the unknown, between caution and curiosity, between fear and the faint, fragile spark of connection. And in that moment neither spoke, yet both felt it, the quiet, tense understanding that what had begun here in the heart of the desert was far from ordinary. The forgotten girl was seeking warmth, yes, but not in ways either of them fully understood yet, and the Apache warrior, steady and watchful, could feel the weight of what was coming, though the details remained hidden in the shadows beyond the firelight, waiting to unfold. Outside, the wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of dust and stone, of distant rivers and hidden life. And inside the tipi, the flickering fire held its own story, one that was just beginning, one that neither could predict, and one that neither would soon forget. The girl shifted again, her gaze falling to the fire as though it might reveal the answers she had long carried in silence. The flames flickered, casting long, trembling shadows across the warrior's face, and the canvas walls of the tipi. He watched her carefully, noting the small movements that betrayed the story behind her. A story of a life interrupted, of safety ripped away, of the kind of loneliness that only comes when the world has turned against you. She finally spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper, and even then it faltered with each word. I wasn't sure where to go, she admitted. The warrior nodded once, almost imperceptibly. He understood the weight of that statement. In the open plains, in the wide stretches of the desert, direction was as much a matter of survival as skill with a weapon or knowledge of the land. To wander without a path was to invite danger at every turn. The girl pulled her knees closer, wrapping her arms around them, the tips of her fingers brushing the edge of the firelight. Her eyes traced the contours of the warrior's features, trying to read the story etched there. His jaw was strong, shadowed in the early sun. And there was an unmistakable tension in the way he held himself. Tension born of years surviving the unforgiving land, of knowing that any mistake could be deadly. Yet despite the caution, there was a steadiness to him that drew her in, that made her believe, even for a moment, that warmth might not only come from fire. I ran from a people, she said finally, the words almost choking her. The warrior's hand moved slightly, a subtle sign that he was listening, that her confession did not fall into emptiness. They said I didn't belong anywhere. She stopped, the sentence unfinished, the weight of it heavy in the small space of the tipi. He did not speak immediately. Words were dangerous in moments like this. They could soothe, or they could wound, and he had learned to measure them with care. Instead, he let the fire speak. The way it crackled and shifted, reflecting light and shadow, just as life often shifted between hope and despair. He could feel the girl's tension, the careful control she exerted over herself to appear smaller, less threatening, as though invisibility could protect her from a world that had not been kind. Outside, the wind rose again, sweeping across the canyon and rattling the tipi flaps. The sound carried with it the promise of movement, of secrets hidden in the distance, and both of them could feel it. There was a rhythm to the desert, a pulse that spoke of dangers unseen, of journeys interrupted, of trails crossed and recrossed. The warrior had followed that rhythm his entire life, and in the quiet way that only a man attuned to the land could. He sensed that this girl's story was far from simple. "You're far from home," he said at last, his voice low and steady. She flinched slightly at the words, though not from fear, but from recognition. She knew the truth in his observation, the simple fact that she had been uprooted from everything familiar. She had crossed plains and canyons, had hidden from the sharp eyes of people who would have taken advantage of her, and had finally stumbled into this quiet refuge, guided more by instinct than by a clear sense of direction. "Yes," she admitted, her shoulders rising with the force of the acknowledgement. "And I don't know if I can go back." Her voice trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. The warrior could see the internal struggle, the battle between fear and determination. She was young, yet she carried a burden heavier than many adults. There was a courage in her fragility, a quiet strength that refused to be extinguished even in the face of uncertainty. The warrior shifted slightly, settling cross-legged near the fire. He did not close the space between them entirely. Distance was a language of trust. It's close too soon, and the fire of the moment could scorch rather than comfort. Yet he allowed his presence to be steady, unyielding, a counterbalance to the girl's vulnerability. His eyes softened only fractionally, but it was enough for her to sense that, in this moment, she might be safe. Outside, a hawk circled high above the canyon, its shadow cutting across the desert floor like a dark stitch on pale fabric. The warrior watched it for a moment, the motion stirring thoughts he rarely spoke aloud. Predators, he knew, were everywhere, not just in the sky, but in the land itself, in people, in choices made too hastily. He could not shield her from all of it, not yet. The girl's hands moved unconsciously to the small satchel she carried, a bag worn thin by travel and care. She touched the contents lightly, almost reverently, as though the bag itself held the remnants of a life she was unwilling to let go completely. The warrior noticed the movement but did not comment. Sometimes the stories people carried were too fragile to be disturbed, and he had learned that patience could be more powerful than questions. The desert is not forgiving to the unprepared. The girl looked up at him then, her dark eyes meeting his. There was a spark there, a mixture of respect and defiance, fear and curiosity. If I didn't move, I don't think I'd be alive. The warrior's jaw tightened slightly at her words. The land was cruel, yes, but people could be even crueler. Her words confirmed what he had suspected. She was running not merely from circumstance, but from danger of a far more personal kind. The warrior's gaze swept the interior of the tipi, noting the small details that spoke of life-interrupted dusty footprints, the faint scent of smoke from travel, the frayed edges of her clothing. Each mark told a story, each detail another thread in the tapestry of her journey. For the first time, perhaps, she allowed herself to feel warmth not just from the flames, but from the presence of another human being who did not demand explanation or compliance. There was a delicate tension in that moment. Timing mattered, and the desert had a way of teaching patience in a world that moved too fast for some hearts. Instead, he chose observation. He noted the way her eyes darted to the tipi's entrance at the faintest sound outside, and he could sense it like a scent carried by the wind, sharp, elusive, compelling. There were truths she did not yet trust herself to speak aloud, and he knew that forcing them would accomplish nothing. Giving her space to decide whether she could share what had brought her into the heart of the Apache territory, the sun climbing higher and casting long shadows that moved like restless spirits across the desert floor. The wind stirred once more, carrying distant sounds of rock and sand shifting, of life existing in forms that were invisible but not absent. The warrior felt the pulse of the land beneath him, steady, patient, unyielding, and he realized that the girl was now a part of that rhythm, however temporarily. Perhaps it could also be about trust, about quiet alliances formed in unexpected ways. About moments of reprieve found in the presence of someone who understood the harshness of the world without needing to exploit it. Neither knew what lay beyond the hills, beyond the next ridge of stone or the curve of the canyon. Danger was always near, unseen, but inevitable. Though she was safe for now, there was an awareness, almost instinctual. The fire crackled, and the wind whispered against the tipi again, carrying a message neither of them fully understood, but both could feel a promise of trials, secrets yet unrevealed, of paths that would converge and diverge in ways neither could predict. The warrior watched her closely, a guardian not by obligation but by recognition of shared resilience. And the girl looked back at him, a flicker of unspoken understanding passing between them. In that quiet, uncertain morning, the desert stretched endlessly beyond, vast and unyielding. And inside the small circle of firelight, two lives had collided, tangled in the fragile threads of trust, fear, and the unspoken mysteries that would shape the days to come. And the questions that hung in the air were heavier than the morning wind itself. The desert sun climbed higher, and the wind carried the scent of distant sagebrush, dry earth, and the faint tang of smoke from other camps far beyond the horizon. Inside the tipi, the girl remained close to the fire, her eyes flitting constantly toward the entrance, as though expecting something or someone to emerge from the dust and heat. He knew it was the same fear he had seen in the eyes of children lost to the wilderness, of travelers who had no choice but to flee, and of people who had learned the hard way that trust was earned, not given. "I was told not to come this way," she said, pausing as if weighing each word. "That the plains were dangerous." Her gaze flicked toward the flaps of the tipi, then back to the fire. "I thought the desert had many faces, some of mercy, some of cruelty, and the plains were never truly empty. There were always eyes watching, always dangers hidden among rocks and shadows. Whoever had sent her, whoever pursued her, was still out there, and the thought stirred the warrior's instincts into readiness. And those who track people like you do not move slowly." The girl flinched slightly at the reminder, but her eyes hardened, a defiance creeping into her posture. She was small, yes, but she had already survived far more than most could imagine, and it showed in the tight set of her shoulders and the wary sharpness in her gaze. "I don't know what exactly, but I couldn't stay." Her voice faltered as she drew her cloak tighter around herself, the weight of memory pressing down. The warrior sensed the depths of her fear. This was no simple flight from hardship. This was survival in its rawest form. Outside the tipi, the desert seemed to sense the tension. Rocks glinted sharply in the sunlight, shadows stretched unnaturally, and the wind whispered across the valley in a low, restless moan. The warrior's eyes flicked toward the openings of the tipi, scanning the horizon with practiced ease. Every rustle of grass, every shift of sand, every distant animal call carried meaning. He was a man attuned to the movements of the land, and the desert was speaking now in a language both urgent and precise. The girl watched him, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. There was something in the way he moved, quiet, deliberate, aware, that made her feel both exposed and strangely protected. She had learned over months of running that the world often offered no sanctuary, no pause, no relief from constant vigilance. It was fragile, tenuous, and it might not last. "I didn't ask for this," she said finally, her voice almost breaking. "I didn't choose any of it. I only wanted. It's a place to be safe, just for a little while." The warrior's gaze softened fractionally. He had learned long ago that survival often required more than skill with a bow or knowledge of the land, and though he had been alone for many seasons, he understood that some encounters were not accidental. They were necessary, shaped by circumstance, chance, and sometimes fate. The fire flickered, casting uneven shadows across the interior of the tipi. The warrior shifted slightly, moving a hand toward a small satchel at his side. Inside were tools, dried food, and a few essential items collected over years of travel and life in the wilderness. He offered some of the food to her, a simple gesture, and she accepted it hesitantly, her eyes never leaving his. She ate slowly, each bite measured, each movement deliberate, as though the act of nourishment itself carried risk. As she ate, the warrior's thoughts drifted briefly to the movements he had noticed on the horizon earlier. Subtle shifts that could indicate another traveler, another threat. The plains were vast, but not all threats were distant. Some were patient, following without revealing themselves, biding time until opportunity presented itself. He felt the tension in his chest tighten, a warning pulse he could not ignore. The girl, meanwhile, kept glancing toward the tipi flaps, drawn by a curiosity she could not suppress. She wondered what lay beyond the reach of the firelight, what secrets the desert might be holding just out of sight. There were moments when the fear threatened to overwhelm her, and she caught herself trembling despite her attempts to appear composed. And he adjusted his stance slightly to keep the firelight steady, to offer warmth not only to her body, but to the fragile sense of trust forming between them. Hours passed in quiet observation. Outside, the wind rose and fell, carrying dust and sand across the plains. The desert seemed alive with unseen movements, rustlings that could signal danger, opportunity, or both. The girl shared fragments of her story, each piece revealing more about the people who had pursued her, the lives she had left behind, and the choices that had driven her to this point. The warrior listened without judgment, absorbing the details, his mind mapping paths, predicting risks, and calculating the probability of pursuit. There was another tension building, one that neither spoke aloud. It was not only the threat of others who might be tracking her, but also the tension of two lives intersecting in a space where neither could fully trust. The warrior had long lived alone, relying on his instincts and knowledge of the land. Yet even as he noted the risks, he felt a faint pull toward her story, a curiosity that he could not deny, and perhaps a sense of responsibility he had not expected to bear. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long, sharp shadows across the desert, the girl finally dared to look more closely at the warrior. "Why? Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice tentative. The warrior's eyes met hers. "Because the land does not reward cruelty when it can be avoided," he said slowly. "And because some paths cross for reasons we do not always understand," he did not elaborate. Words were sometimes too fragile to carry the weight of meaning, and actions often spoke louder than speech. Outside, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves on distant rock. It's a quiet clatter of something or someone moving in the distance. The plains were vast, but there was no hiding from the patterns of pursuit, from the persistent eyes of those who would follow, relentlessly. The girl's pulse quickened. She had spent so long fleeing, so long hiding, that any sound from the outside world could ignite terror, even when it was nothing. The warrior reached out, a subtle gesture of reassurance, though he did not break his careful stance. He had learned to trust instinct as much as sight, and his instincts told him that their moment of pause would not last long. Something or someone was coming, and both would need to be ready, though neither could know the full extent of what awaited them. The firelight flickered across the interior of the tipi, shadows leaping and dancing, reflecting the tension coiling between the two of them. The warrior's eyes narrowed on the horizon, muscles tense, bow within reach, mind calculating distance, wind direction, and possible escape routes. The desert outside was quiet in one sense, yet it vibrated with the hidden potential for conflict, danger, and revelation. Neither spoke again for a long moment. The unspoken understanding between them deepened the realization that this was only the beginning. Both were aware that survival would require more than instinct, more than skill, more than trust. It would demand courage, awareness, and a readiness to face threats that had been stalking the plains long before either had arrived. And so the afternoon passed, the wind carrying whispers across the desert that seemed to echo the questions hanging in the tipi. Who pursued the girl? What had she carried that drew danger toward her? Could trust exist in a world built on pursuit and fear? The warrior and the girl remained within the fragile circle of firelight, aware that answers would come but uncertain when or if they would find them. Outside, the desert waited, and within the tipi, two lives were poised on the edge of change. Each aware that the peace they had found was temporary, that the conflict pressing in from the plains would not be avoided, that the shadows beyond the firelight carried secrets yet to be revealed. The sun had dipped low over the canyon, turning the desert sand a dull orange, the shadows stretching long and uncertain. Inside the tipi, the girl and the Apache warrior remained tense, aware that the fragile peace of the day was fraying. The air was thick with anticipation, each sound from outside the rustle of wind, the faint crack of distant rock like a heartbeat, warning of something approaching. Neither spoke, both listening, both attuned to the subtle language of the land. The girl's hand tightened on the edge of her cloak. Her eyes, wide and alert, flicked toward the flaps of the tipi with every gust of wind. She had spent weeks learning to read signs, to sense danger before it arrived, and now her instincts screamed that the world outside had shifted. She could feel eyes watching her, though she could see no one. The warrior, noting her unease, did not move immediately. He trusted her senses as much as his own, and knew the signs were rarely wrong. "They're close," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire.
Aye.
The warrior's eyes narrowed, trained to detect even the slightest tremor in the land. There had been patterns to pursuit he had followed countless times, and now he recognized them in the subtle disturbances of sand, the broken stalk of a distant brush, the faint echo of hooves in the distance. He moved deliberately, not hastily. He adjusted the fire to create deeper shadows along the edges of the tipi, ensuring that any movement outside would be harder to detect. His hand rested on his bow, fingers brushing the notches of the string. He did not speak. There was no need. The girl understood. Survival demanded focus, anticipation, and patience. Words could wait. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of smoke from far beyond the canyon, mingling with the dry desert dust. Yes. The warrior smelled it first, the subtle metallic temps that accompanied the presence of armed men. He recognized it instinctively. Whoever was approaching was not casual travelers. They were hunters, and they had already tracked the girl across miles of unforgiving terrain. "She's here," one voice called from the distance, sharp and rough. The warrior's ears twitched, picking up the direction without movement. The voice carried authority, impatience, the kind born of men used to taking what they wanted without resistance. He could feel the tension coiled tighter in the girl's shoulders, the faint tremor in her hands betraying her composure. "Stay low," he said quietly, though not close enough for her to feel constricted. His voice carried authority, calm but deliberate. "Do not move until you see what they do." She nodded, swallowing hard, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. She had learned to mask fear, but even she could not fully hide the tension that knotted through her body. The footsteps approached, crunching against dry stone and loose sand. The warrior's gaze swept the horizon, calculating the distance, the angle, the possible strategies they might employ. Every instinct honed over years of surviving the plains screamed readiness. He knew that once the hunters arrived, the moment for patience would end, replaced by the urgency of action. The girl's voice trembled, though she did not speak aloud. Her mind raced, recalling the stories of those who had tried to flee and failed, those who had been caught because they hesitated for even a single heartbeat. She felt the pulse of danger through her veins, the raw edge of fear, yet beneath it was the spark of determination that had carried her this far. She would not be caught easily, not tonight, not here. The voices grew louder, closer. The desert had swallowed many footsteps before, yet these were different, deliberate, confident, cruel. The warrior shifted slightly, his movements silent but precise, preparing for the moment when concealment could no longer protect them. His eyes scanned the terrain, noting every ridge, every boulder, every shadow where an enemy could hide. There was no margin for error. "She can't be far," one of the voices said, frustration underlying the words. "The girl has to be here. You can't lose her now." The urgency in their tone confirmed the warrior's instinct. These men were desperate, and desperation made them dangerous. He signaled subtly with a tilt of his head, indicating the safest spots for the girl to move if confrontation became unavoidable. Her eyes followed the gesture, understanding the silent plan forming between them. The firelight flickered, casting shapes that seemed to move independently in the corners of the tipi. The girl hugged her knees closer, listening, her mind racing through every detail of the journey that had brought her here. She remembered the long nights hiding in the brush, the narrow escapes along jagged cliffs, the men who had pursued her relentlessly. All of it had led to this moment, the edge of the desert. The circle of firelight, the warrior who had offered her temporary refuge. The sound of hooves struck again, heavier now, accompanied by the shuffle of boots against stone. The warriors outside were nearing, relentless in their pursuit. The Apache warrior adjusted his grip on his bow, the taut string humming slightly under his fingers. He was ready for confrontation, ready to defend, ready to use every skill the land had taught him. The girl, though frightened, mirrored his tension, ready to act, to move, to survive. A shadow moved past the tipi's entrance, fleeting but unmistakable. The girl's breath caught. The warrior's eyes followed it, narrowing on the subtle shape. A man on horseback, scanning, searching, unaware of the presence inside. The warrior knew the danger: one mistake, one premature move, and they would be discovered. He signaled subtly with his hand, drawing the girl's attention to remain silent, remain patient. Every second counted. The wind howled again, shifting, masking some sounds while amplifying others. The desert had its own rhythm, its own way of hiding and revealing, and both of them were forced to dance within it. The girl's heart raced. She could feel the energy building, the tension tightening like a drawn bowstring. The moment of confrontation approaching with relentless inevitability. "Don't make a sound," the warrior murmured. The girl's lips pressed together, her gaze locked on the small shadow moving outside. Her mind traced every possible escape, every route to safety. "I said that," but the warrior's presence was the anchor, the steady force guiding her through the uncertainty. Another shadow appeared, closer, heavier, carrying the unmistakable weight of intent. They were hunting, not wandering. The girl could sense it, every instinct screaming danger. She tightened her grip on her cloak, feeling the firelight flicker across her hands. The heat a thin comfort against the chill of fear. The warrior shifted again, silent as a desert cat, moving to create the most advantageous position. His eyes never left the movements outside. The men were skilled, experienced in tracking, and they would not give up easily. He knew the risk, and yet he remained poised, his presence both a shield and a warning. The girl's mind flashed back to the days she had spent running, hiding, moving through the wilderness without pause. Every memory sharpened her awareness. She knew the hunter's tactics, the patience required to catch someone unprepared, the ways the desert could betray even the cautious. And she knew with a cold certainty that this was the culmination of all those months of survival. The shadows moved closer to the tipi's edge, voices carrying clearly now, rough and demanding. "She can't hide forever," one said. "She has to be here. We'll find her." The warrior's fingers brushed the string of his bow, ready to react. The girl's pulse raced, matching the rhythm of the desert tension outside. The climax of pursuit was at hand, and neither knew what would come first, the attack, the revelation, or the narrow thread of escape. Time seemed to stretch, every second elongated by the heightening suspense. "Ah!" The girl could hear her own heartbeat, feel it echoing the pounding of hooves outside. The warrior's steady presence was a tether to reality, a reminder that while danger loomed, survival was still possible. Every instinct, every movement, every decision in the next moments would determine the outcome of a confrontation neither had fully anticipated. Yet both were prepared to face. Outside, the shadows stopped. Men paused, scanning the landscape, calculating, unaware of the firelight that betrayed nothing. The desert held its breath, the wind stilling for a moment, as if acknowledging the precipice upon which both hunter and hunted now balanced. The tension coiled tighter, unrelenting, the climax approaching like a storm over the canyon. Inside, the girl pressed herself closer to the warrior, her trust solidifying even as fear surged. The Apache warrior's eyes met hers briefly, conveying both warning and reassurance. There was no turning back now. Confrontation, the culmination of pursuit and survival, was imminent. Every muscle, every breath, every shadow carried the weight of what was to come. The desert outside seemed to vibrate with anticipation, the wind moaning through the cliffs like the prelude to an explosion of action. The firelight danced across the tipi, casting elongated shadows that seemed almost alive. The girl's fingers brushed the edge of the fire, heat grounding her even as her mind raced through possibilities, plans, and strategies. And in that frozen moment, just before the inevitable, silence stretched across the canyon, punctuated only by the distant scrape of hooves and the whisper of wind over stone. The warrior and the girl were poised on the edge of confrontation, every sense heightened, every nerve alert. The story that had begun with flight and refuge was about to reach its most intense hour. The desert holding its secrets just out of reach, the tension unbroken, the climax waiting to erupt. The wind howled across the canyon as the first figures emerged from the shadows, hooves kicking up dust that hung thick in the air. The Apache warrior had moved with silent precision, positioning himself and the girl where the firelight would not betray them. He could see the determination etched on the hunters' faces, the kind of resolve born from greed and habit. But he also knew the land better than anyone. Every ridge, every rock, every shadow could be used to turn the advantage. He signaled subtly to the girl, guiding her without words. A silent plan formed between them through instinct and shared awareness. The girl's pulse pounded in her chest, every instinct sharpened by months of fleeing and hiding. She had learned to move quietly, to anticipate danger, to read the slightest signs of pursuit. Yet the stakes had never been higher. She felt the heat of the fire at her back, the solid presence of the warrior at her side, and the weight of uncertainty pressing in from every direction. The desert seemed to hold its breath with them, the vast open land a witness to what would unfold. A shadow passed too close to the tipi, and the warrior reacted, a swift motion that drew the string of his bow taut. He fired a single arrow, precise and controlled, that struck the ground near the intruder's feet with a sharp thud. The man startled, falling back, and a shout carried across the canyon. It was the spark that ignited the confrontation. The other hunters moved faster now, reckless in their pursuit, their confidence shaken by the sudden, unexpected resistance. The girl watched, tense and alert. She realized the warrior's skill was unmatched. Years of living in the unforgiving desert had honed him into a master of survival, patience, and strategy. Every movement he made was deliberate, every step calculated. She felt herself both in awe and reassured by his presence. I'd found a protector, someone who understood the land and its dangers as deeply as she understood the instinct to survive. The hunters advanced, but the warrior was always one step ahead. He led them through narrow corridors between rocks and brush, guiding the girl along a path that kept them hidden while exhausting their pursuers. The desert itself seemed to conspire with him, every ridge providing cover, every shadow a shield. The girl followed closely, trusting his judgment, the rhythm of their movement unspoken but perfect. As they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the canyon, the warrior stopped, signaling her to stay low. From their vantage point, they could see the hunters regrouping, frustrated and confused by the sudden disappearance of their quarry. The warrior scanned the horizon, then turned to the girl, his eyes steady and serious. "We move carefully," he said. "Not because we must hide, but because we choose when and how to act." The girl nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm in the midst of chaos. Hours passed as the sun dipped further, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple. The warriors outside were growing tired, their impatience making them careless. The Apache warrior seized the moment, Using the terrain to their advantage, rocks were dislodged, small traps set with the natural elements of the canyon. The girl followed, learning quickly how the land could be both ally and weapon. Each step reinforced her growing sense of confidence, her trust in the warrior, and her understanding that survival was as much about cunning as it was about strength. The hunters realized too late that they were being outmaneuvered. Their frustration boiled into reckless aggression, and the desert swallowed their mistakes. Rocks tumbled where they shouldn't, sand shifted underfoot, and every misstep revealed their vulnerability. The warrior and the girl remained hidden, silent and patient, until the final moment came. When it did, the confrontation was swift and decisive. The warrior struck with precision, not to harm unnecessarily, but to protect. The hunters were forced to retreat, their threat neutralized by the combined cunning of the warrior and the land itself. The girl watched, heart racing, as the last of them disappeared into the distance. Realizing that danger had been survived not by brute force alone, but by knowledge, patience, and trust. The canyon fell silent again, save for the whisper of the wind and the crackle of the fire. The girl sank to her knees, exhaustion overwhelming her, but relief and gratitude flooding through her as well. The warrior remained standing, scanning the horizon, ensuring that the threat had truly passed before allowing himself to relax. Finally, he returned to the fire, sitting across from her with the quiet authority that had guided them through the day. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm but firm. The girl exhaled slowly, the tension in her body easing for the first time in days. She looked at him, eyes wide with admiration and something deeper, something like respect mixed with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. I don't know what I would have done without you." The warrior's gaze softened slightly. "You survived because you were ready," he said, "because you kept moving, because you listened to the land, because you made choices when you could. I only guided you." His words were simple, but they carried weight, acknowledging her courage and resilience. The girl felt the truth in them, recognizing that she had not been entirely helpless, that her own instincts had carried her this far. As night fell, the desert transformed into a canvas of stars, the vast sky mirrored in the silent valleys below. The girl and the warrior sat together by the fire, sharing a quiet meal, the heat of the flames warding off the chill of the night. Conversation came slowly at first, fragments of stories, memories, and reflections shared between them. She learned more about the warrior, his life, his connection to the land, his experiences with travelers and hunters alike. In turn, he learned more about her journey, the people she had fled, and the courage that had kept her alive. The girl realized that this night marked more than survival. It marked a turning point, a recognition that even in a world filled with danger, trust and cooperation could create moments of safety and understanding. She felt a sense of belonging she had not known in months, perhaps years, a fragile bond that had been forged in firelight, danger, and shared instinct. "You'll need to decide what comes next," the warrior said after a long silence. "The plains are wide and threats are many, but you are stronger than you know. You've survived what most would not, and that is worth remembering." The girl nodded, absorbing the words, the truth of them resonating deep within her. The desert had tested her, and she had endured. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope. Hope that she could continue forward, not just surviving, but living. Hope that the land could be more than a place of danger, that guidance and trust could lead her through the harshest of trials. And hope that the human connections forged even in moments of fear could carry her toward safety and understanding. The Apache warrior watched her quietly, sensing the subtle shift in her demeanor. The way her posture relaxed, the way her eyes, though still wary, reflected a cautious optimism. He had seen this before in travelers who had found refuge, those who had learned that the land could be both cruel and generous, and that survival required both. He felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that she had grown stronger through the trial, that she had not only survived but had begun to understand the balance between caution and trust. The night deepened, stars gleaming like diamonds above the desert's vast expanse. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant fires, a reminder of the world beyond the immediate moment. Yet within the small circle of firelight, the girl felt warmth, security, and a sense of possibility that had been absent for so long. The warrior remained by her side, a steady presence, a guide, and a silent protector. By dawn, The canyon was bathed in the soft glow of morning light. The girl rose, stretching, feeling the ache of the past days in her muscles, but also the clarity of survival, of endurance, and of lessons learned. She looked at the warrior, gratitude and respect shining in her eyes. "I think I can continue," she said softly. "I know now that I'm not alone, and that I can face what comes next." The warrior nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "The land is wide and the journey is long, but you are ready. Keep moving, keep observing, and trust what you have learned." He gestured toward the canyon beyond, the path that stretched into unknown terrain, carrying both promise and risk. The girl felt a surge of determination, a readiness to meet the challenges that awaited her, armed with the lessons of the desert and the guidance of the warrior who had protected her. As she stepped into the first light of dawn, the wind carrying the faint smell of earth and sage, she felt a sense of renewal, connection to the land and the story she was now part of. The Apache warrior watched her go, knowing that the desert had tested them both. The conflict had ended not through brute force alone, but through skill, patience, and trust. He felt a quiet pride in her courage and in the choices she had made to survive and grow stronger. The canyon returned to its silence, the echoes of the past night lingering only in memory. The girl's journey was far from over, but she carried with her the strength, resilience, and awareness that would guide her through whatever lay ahead. And the warrior, rooted in the land that had shaped him, remained a silent witness, knowing that some encounters leave lasting marks on both those who seek refuge and those who provide it. The sun rose fully over the desert, painting the landscape with warmth and light. The story of the forgotten girl and the Apache warrior reached its conclusion, yet its lessons lingered, trust earned through shared struggle, courage forged in the crucible of survival, and the quiet power of human connection in a world defined by both danger and beauty. In the vast, endless plains, life continued, and the memory of that night of fear met with skill and heart became part of the desert's enduring story.